The sky was on fire the first time Commander Dara Vasquez surfaced the glaive in 18 months. She didn't go up herself. She sent Kowalski, the sensor tech, because Kowalski still had some stubborn optimism left in him, the kind that hadn't yet been burned out by 2 years of running dark. He climbed the ladder, cracked the hatch 6 centimeters, and came back down with his face the color of old chalk. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just sat on the bottom rung and breathed through his nose. "How bad?" Vasquez said. "The whole horizon," he said, like someone lit the atmosphere. She had calculated the possibility. She just hadn't let herself believe it until now. The glaive was 300 meters below the South Atlantic when the Keth first arrived. That had been the only thing that saved her, and the 41 people aboard. The depth, the silence, the fact that the Keth's initial sweep had been thermal, and the ocean ran cold below the thermocline. They had watched it on passive sonar, the great alien dreadnoughts passing overhead like iron weather, and not one crew member had made a sound. Vasquez had cut life support to minimum, cut the reactor to its lowest murmur, and told everybody to sleep and pray in whatever order worked best for them. That was the first week. Now it was week 73, and someone had set the sky on fire. She climbed up herself. The hatch opened, and the heat hit her like a furnace door thrown back. She gripped the combing and looked up and did not look away, because she had decided a long time ago that the things you don't look at still kill you. They just do it with your eyes closed. The upper atmosphere was a continuous red-orange sheet, pulsing at the edges like something breathing. The ocean surface reflected it back, so that the world above and below were both the same terrible color. It smelled of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong, like old bone in a crematorium. She stayed up for 90 seconds. Then she went back down and sealed the hatch. She spread the chart on the navigation table and put her thumb on a point in the grid. Keth Lattice. That was what Earth Command, when there had still been an Earth Command, had called the network of atmospheric processors the aliens had installed during the first 6 months of occupation. 17 installations, each one roughly the size of a mid-sized city, positioned at precise intervals along the geomagnetic lines. Nobody had known what they were for, not at first. The linguists had spent 8 weeks trying to decode Keth transmissions before the processors switched on, and then it didn't matter what they said, because the upper atmosphere started reacting. The Van Allen belts destabilizing, the radiation layer fragmenting, the heat bleeding upward in columns of what their instruments called nothing we have a word for. The Earth was being rendered. That was the simplest way Vasquez could say it. The way you render fat from a carcass. "How long?" said Dr. Wren from across the table. He wasn't asking how long the fire had been burning. He meant how long until the surface was uninhabitable. Vasquez looked at her calculations. She'd been running them every 3 days for 4 weeks. At current rate of atmospheric degradation, 21 days. Give or take. Wren was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses that he still wore, even though one lens had a crack running diagonal. He tapped the crack with his finger now, a habit she'd learned to read as him thinking hard. And the Keth installation at the Mariana convergence point. You still think it's the primary relay. I think it's the keystone. The others are nodes. Take out the keystone, the lattice fails. The atmosphere restores itself. She paused. Theoretically, Wren echoed. Lieutenant Sorrell, her XO, had been standing at parade rest since Kowalski came down looking like a ghost. He spoke now, quietly, in the way he had when he disagreed, and knew she already knew he disagreed. The Keth have 3 dreadnoughts parked over the Mariana Zone. We saw them on the passive array 12 hours ago. We go up there, they detect us. They'll try to kill us, Vasquez said.
"Yes, we have 4 torpedoes. We have 4 torpedoes.
Sorrell looked at Wren. Wren looked at his cracked lens. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that this was a submarine carrying 42 souls and 4 weapons. And it was being asked to neutralize an alien war installation defended by capital ships, in order to prevent the extinction of a species, on a theory. On a theory held by one exhausted woman who hadn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 2 months. Vasquez pulled out the small flask she kept in her breast pocket. Actual coffee. Freeze-dried, reconstituted with drinking water, tasting of nothing and everything, and set it on the table. A ritual, an invitation. After a moment, Sorrel picked it up and drank, and passed it to Wren, and Wren passed it to Kowalski, who'd been lingering at the hatch ladder, still looking pale. And Kowalski drank and handed it back to Vasquez, and she finished it. Plot a course for the Mariana Basin, she said. We run silent, we run deep, we run fast. She folded the chart. And somebody wake up Rodriguez and tell him I need the torpedo bays inspected. Because if we're going to do something stupid, we're going to do it with functioning equipment. The Glaive was not a warship. That was the first thing visitors had always said about her. The ones who came aboard during the commissioning tour before the world ended. She's beautiful, almost elegant, not like a weapon at all. And she wasn't, not exactly. She was a deep survey vessel, military-funded but science-purposed, built to go deeper and quieter than anything ever sent down by a human navy. Her hull was a composite ceramic titanium laminate that ate sonar pings. Drive was a magneto-hydrodynamic system that produced no cavitation and almost no thermal signature. She could sustain depth pressures that would have collapsed any previous submarine, and she could do it for months at a time. She had been on her shakedown run when the Keth arrived, which meant she was deep and quiet and hidden and alive. Vasquez had commanded her for 18 months before that. She knew every creak and tick and vibration of the hull, the way a long-married person knows the sounds of a house. She knew which pump ran 2 decibels louder than spec, which sonar array had a resonance problem in cold water, which bunk in crew quarters developed a rattle at 400 meters that drove its occupant to sleep in the passageway. She knew her boat. She also knew her crew, and she knew that the 41 people around her were running on the wrong side of scared. Not broken, not yet. But the margin was thinning, the drills still executed cleanly. The watches still turned with military punctuality. The mess was quieter than it should have been. The jokes had shortened and stopped, and she'd noticed that more people were sleeping than the duty cycle required. Not exhaustion sleep, escape sleep. The kind where you close your eyes because the world behind them is easier. She gave them 12 hours. She stood 2 watches herself, back to back, to let as many people sleep as possible, and she did not explain why. Because if she said, I'm letting you sleep because some of you are going to die in 3 days, that would defeat the purpose. She let Petty Officer Chun repair a filtration pump that didn't strictly need repair, because Chun needed to repair something with her hands. She let Ensign Diaz run nav calculations that the computer had already run, because Diaz needed the math to feel real. She let Kowalski play trumpet, badly, quietly, for 30 minutes in the forward torpedo room, because Kowalski needed the physical act of making music more than she needed silence, and because 30 minutes of bad trumpet at depth was worth the trade. She didn't sleep. She sat in the control room in her chair and ran the approach vectors in her head and did the same calculation she'd been doing for 3 days. The one that ended with 4 torpedoes and a keystone installation, and, theoretically, on the 14th hour of transit, they found the wreckage. It was scattered across a 60-kilometer field of ocean floor. The USN Adirondack, one of the Atlantic Fleet submarines, or what was left of her. Hull sections, equipment pods, the kind of debris that tells you a ship died fast and badly. Vasquez held the Glaive still in the thermocline and watched the sonar return for a long time. 42 crew on the Adirondack, all of them sitting on the bottom now, distributed across 60 kilometers of cold dark. Mark the coordinates, she said. Marked, said Sorrel. That's all we can do for them right now. She said it like a fact because it was one. Helm, resume course. The Adirondack had been a combat boat, built, properly armed, carrying twice the ordnance the Glaive had. And the Keth had opened her like a tin can. Vasquez did not share that thought with anyone. She filed it in the place where she kept the other thoughts she couldn't afford to have yet. After, she told herself, after is when you have those thoughts, not now. And she kept her face neutral and her voice steady, and she watched the depth display tick deeper. The Mariana Zone announced itself on passive array 17 hours out. Not sound exactly. The Keth systems ran on frequencies that didn't translate well to audio, but the array's interpretation algorithms rendered them as a low harmonic, a chord held just below human hearing, that you felt in your back teeth more than you heard. It was, Vasquez thought, not unlike the sound of standing next to a very large transformer. That sense of proximity to enormous contained power. She took the glaive to 900 meters. Cold enough here that the thermal masking was good. The hull ticked and groaned with pressure equalization. She watched the passive display and counted the contacts overhead. 3 dreadnoughts, just as the array had suggested. 2 smaller escorts, faster ships, patrol configurations, the Keth equivalent of destroyers. 5 ships above, all of them positioned like a crown, around the convergence point where the Lattice's keystone node sat on the ocean floor. 800 meters below the surface. 2,000 meters below the glaive's current depth. Ren came forward and stood beside her chair. His cracked lens caught the blue instrument light in a way that made his face look asymmetrical, half-lit, half-shadow. He had a tablet with him, and he put it on her armrest without comment, and she looked at the diagram he'd been working on. The lattice node on the ocean floor was not undefended. He'd managed to reconstruct something of its architecture from the array harmonics. There was a field emitter, a weapon system, or something that functioned as one, oriented upward and outward from the node in a cone pattern. Anything approaching from above would be detected and engaged. The range was uncertain. Power was not. The array readings suggested enough output to gut a ship the size of the glaive in under 4 seconds. So we don't come from above, Vasquez said. The Mariana Trench, Ren said. The actual trench. The deepest part of the floor, here, he touched the diagram, is below the node's detection cone. Below its floor mount. If you could get underneath it and fire up. Torpedoes run straight, Sorrel said from the nav station. Can't fire up from below the trench floor and hit a target that's straight up, Vasquez said. Vertical shot. Through the trench. Into the underside of the node. Silence. The glaive had not been designed for vertical torpedo launches. She had 4 forward tubes, all fixed on a flat bearing. The trench dropped to nearly 11,000 meters at its deepest, and if you position the boat on a severe up angle at the bottom of that drop, not vertical, not quite, but close enough, and if the torpedoes were adjusted for the depth pressure and the angle, and if someone very good at math spent the next 6 hours running the calculations so they didn't simply blow themselves on the attempt. Diaz, Vasquez said. Ensign Diaz looked up from the nav console. How do you feel about applied trigonometry under pressure? He blinked. Then, carefully, not quite smiling, I feel pretty good about it, Commander. Good. Get with Ren. I need a firing solution that doesn't exist in the manual. The descent into the trench proper took 4 hours and felt like dying slowly. The hull did not creak at this depth. It sang. A continuous near-subsonic note. The ceramic titanium composite, speaking in a register just at the edge of perception, telling anyone who was listening that the pressure was now in a regime that submarines were not designed to survive. The instruments showed hull stress readings that Vasquez chose not to display on the main screen, because the main screen was visible to everyone, and there was no upside to 42 people watching a number she was already watching. The lighting shifted at depth, not mechanically. The glaive's LEDs were consistent, but psychologically. Everything looked different below 8,000 meters. The shadows seemed thicker. People moved more carefully, as if sudden movement might remind the ocean they were there. Nobody played trumpet. Nobody repaired unnecessary pumps. They sat at their stations and worked and were very, very quiet. It was Rodriguez who broke it, and he broke it in the right way. He was a large, unhurried man, the chief torpedo tech, and he came up to the control room with a wrench in his hand and a piece of tape on his forehead that he'd written something on in marker. Vasquez noticed the tape. The crew noticed her noticing the tape. What does it say? She asked. Says, still breathing, Rodriguez said. It's a reminder. Someone laughed. It was a compressed sound, not fully formed but real. Vasquez nodded at Rodriguez, who went back to his torpedoes, and the crew went back to their stations, and the hull kept singing its deep pressure note, and somehow the room felt slightly larger than it had. Diaz and Ren found the solution at hour 6. It was, as Vasquez had expected, deeply inadvisable. The glaive would need to position at 9,800 meters on a 38-degree up angle, achievable barely, at the northern slope of the trench's deepest section. That angle, all 4 torpedoes fired simultaneously would converge on the node's underside. at a point approximately 1,100 meters above. The timing window was 11 seconds from the moment of firing to detonation, which meant 11 seconds for the Keth systems above to respond, and they would respond, because 4 torpedoes moving upward through 1,100 meters of ocean were not going to be quiet or subtle or invisible. They would be spotted. The escorts would engage. The dreadnoughts would engage. "We'll be moving when they engage," Vasquez said. "Full emergency ascent due west the moment the torpedoes leave the tubes. If we get to 3,000 meters before they can localize us, the node will be gone," Wren said, "and the lattice will fail, and the atmosphere will stop burning," Vasquez said. "Theoretically." "Why do you keep saying theoretically?" Kowalski said from the sensor station. He didn't say it as a complaint. He sounded genuinely curious, the way he'd sounded when he used to ask her technical questions during the shakedown tour before the world ended. Vasquez considered the question. "Because I was trained to caveat my conclusions when the evidence is incomplete. The evidence here is incomplete." She paused. "I've been underwater for 18 months running the numbers, and this is the best theory I've got. And theories are what humans do when we don't have certainty. We build the best model we can, and then we act on it, and we find out if we were right. And if we're wrong?" Sorrel asked. "Then, we're wrong at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and we'll never know it. And I can live with that." She stopped. "Bad word choice. You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," Sorrel said. She looked around the control room. Diaz at nav, still with the look of someone who'd been running trigonometry for 6 hours. Kowalski with the passive array feed, watching the harmonic patterns of the lattice overhead. Rodriguez's team in the torpedo room, voices quiet through the intercom as they made the final adjustments. The medic, OC, standing with her back to the bulkhead because there was nothing for her to do yet, and she was the kind of person who needed to be somewhere specific when there was nothing to do. "I need to say something," Vasquez said. She said it to the control room, but she left the ship in intercom open so Rodriguez and the torpedo team could hear it, and the engine room, and everyone in their bunks who were pretending to sleep. "I'm not going to tell you this is going to work. I don't know that. I'm not going to tell you to be brave. Because you already are. You've been brave for 18 months, and you know how to do it without me narrating it back to you." She let a breath out. "What I'm going to tell you is this. In about 40 minutes, we're going to do something that nobody else has managed to do in this war. Going to hit them. Whatever happens after that, we hit them, and they are going to feel it." She looked at the harmonic display. "Now let's go." At 9,800 meters, the glaive stopped descending. The up angle was achieved in small increments, the bow planes biting into water so cold and so compressed, it barely moved like water at all. The hull stress indicator, which Vasquez had removed from the main display, she now watched on a secondary screen, angled only toward her chair. It was in a range she had no doctrine for. She had never trained for this depth. Nobody had. Diaz read off the bearing continuously, his voice precisely level, like a man who had decided that being professional was the same thing as not dying. Maybe it was. Vasquez had found that belief useful before. "Bearing established," Diaz said. "Solution locked." "Rodriguez," Vasquez said into the intercom. "Torpedoes. You're loaded, set, and very unhappy about being this deep," Rodriguez said. "On your word, Commander." She looked at the passive display. The lattice harmonic was directly above them. Not the node itself, but the field of influence it generated, the thing that was cooking the sky. She thought of the sky she'd seen from the hatch, the terrible red-orange sheet, the smell of burning. She thought of Kowalski's tape, still breathing. "Fire," she said. The 4 torpedoes left the tubes in a cluster, and the glaive lurched with the displacement, the bow pitching in the combined pressure wave. And Vasquez grabbed her armrest and watched the bearing hold. Diaz's hands white on the controls, holding her on track, holding the angle, and then she said, "All ahead emergency. Come to course 270. Get us up." The glaive's drive system, which had been built for silence, was not built for speed. It gave what it had. The numbers climbed to 400 meters, 8,800 meters, the hull stress readings falling as the pressure dropped, the boat shaking with the acceleration, and above them unseen, 4 torpedoes were rising through the darkness at 200 meters per second. The Keth responded at second 4. Passive array lit up with signals Vasquez had never seen before. Not attack runs, not weapons signatures, but something else. A kind of cascading harmonic failure spreading outward from the convergence point above, node by node, like a string of lights going out. She watched it happen and couldn't understand it and didn't stop the ascent. At second 9, something hit the glaive from above. Not a weapon, a wave. A pressure wave of staggering proportions traveling downward through the water column. And it hit the ascending submarine and rang through every frame and bulkhead. And the lights went out and came back and went out again, and Vasquez heard the hull making noises she had no word for. And she held on and heard other people holding on all around her in the dark. And she said, "Helm, hold course." "Holding," Diaz said in the dark. His voice had lost none of its precision. The emergency lighting came on, red-tinted, amber-tinted, faces strange in it. The array was screaming data. Vasquez looked at it and tried to parse the volume of information and could not yet. "Kowalski," she said. "What do I have up there?" Kowalski's hands moved across the array controls. His face was lit from below by the display, making him look like he was examining something by candlelight. He didn't speak for 30 seconds while he filtered and interpreted, and she let him take the time because there was no value in rushing him. "3 dreadnoughts," he said and stopped. "What about them?" "There, Commander. They're moving. All 3. They're moving away from the convergence point. Fast." A pause. "The escorts, too." There another pause. Longer. "The Lattice harmonics. I'm not reading them anymore." Silence. "Run the scan again," Vasquez said. "Run it 4 times. He turned to look at her. His face in the red emergency lighting was the same color it had been when he came down the hatch ladder 73 days ago. But the expression on it was completely different. "I'm not reading the Lattice harmonics." Vasquez looked at Ren. Ren touched his cracked lens. For once he didn't tap it. He just rested his finger against the crack and looked at the data feed. And after a moment, he made a sound that was not quite a word, and was not quite not a word. Something between them. "Come to periscope depth," Vasquez said quietly. "Let's go up and look." The ascent took 40 minutes. The glaive surfaced slowly, cautiously, running active array sweeps at every 100 meters to check for threats. The Keth contacts were still moving, all of them heading in the same broad direction, southwest, away from the Mariana Zone, which Vasquez had never seen them do before. Keth ships did not retreat. Their tactical doctrine, insofar as human analysis had been able to determine it, was predicated on overwhelming force applied in place. You did not retreat when you were overwhelming force, unless something removed the reason to stay. The hatch opened. The heat hit her, but it was different. Not cooler, not yet. Maybe not for days or weeks. The atmospheric equilibrium wouldn't restore itself in an hour. Different. The character of the heat had changed. The red-orange sheet was fragmenting at the edges, breaking into distinct cloud formations that moved like normal weather. And between the fragments there was sky. Actual sky, dark sky. The black of the upper atmosphere where before there had been only continuous fire. As she watched, a section of the burning sheet broke away and dissipated in a long, trailing arc, like a cloth burning through and coming apart. She stood on the hull for 3 minutes. Then she went back down. Nobody asked her anything. They could read it on her face, and what they read made several of them produce expressions she hadn't seen on them in 18 months. Not relief, exactly. Too early for relief, too much still unknown, too many Keth ships still in the solar system, too much damage still to assess. Something under relief. The structural foundation that relief gets built on. Sorrel was looking at her from the exo station with an expression she hadn't seen on him either. And she recognized it eventually as, "You were right." She didn't feel like gloating about it. She just felt like sitting down. She sat down in her chair. "Rodriguez," she said into the intercom. "Commander, we just used our last torpedoes." "I'm aware," Rodriguez said. "So what do we do now?" There was a pause on the intercom, and she could hear the torpedo room in the background, the usual small sounds of men and women in a mechanical space. And then Rodriguez said, with absolute seriousness, "I believe the traditional next step is to go home." "Yeah," Vasquez said. "I think you're right." She looked at the chart. Home was not a simple coordinate anymore. Home was whatever was left. Whatever surface remained after 73 days of burning sky and alien occupation, and humans adapting in the particular stubborn way that humans adapted, which was badly and noisily and without elegance and somehow, despite everything, effectively. There are other submarines, Wren said. He had moved to stand near her chair. His showed a list, designations, last known positions, the incomplete and fragmentary intelligence picture that was all they had. Other people who've been doing what we've been doing. Running dark. Waiting. Not anymore, Vasquez said. Done waiting. She reached forward and brought the navigation display live. Plot me a course for the North Atlantic comms relay. The one at 300 meters that the Keth don't know about, or didn't the last time we had intelligence on it. She paused. Let's go find out who else is still breathing. Kowalski, at the sensor station, reached up and touched the piece of tape on his forehead. He'd put one on himself sometime in the last 4 hours. She hadn't noticed when, and read it to himself quietly. Then he settled into his seat and started running his arrays, and the glaive began to move. She moved quietly. She moved through water that had been a battlefield and was now something else. A grave, perhaps, for some of what had been lost, but also just ocean again. Cold and deep and indifferent, in the way that the deep ocean had always been indifferent, which was not hostile, not cruel, just vast. The glaive ran through it like a small and purposeful, and entirely unreasonable thing, which was the only way humans had ever run through anything. The sky above them was going out, not all at once. The lattice died the way any complex system dies. Reluctantly, section by section, the nodes failing in sequence as the keystone's energy cascaded through the network and found nothing to sustain it. 3 days, sensors in the upper atmosphere that still functioned would record the fragmentation, the radiation belts restabilizing, the heat columns collapsing, the burning sheet of atmosphere breaking into discrete pockets, and those pockets cooling and dispersing. 3 weeks, Vasquez had calculated. 21 days to restore equilibrium to a breathable margin, longer to something resembling normal. The fire was going out. Below it, the glaive crossed the South Atlantic, running dark. And in the control room, the crew had gotten loud again in the particular way of people who have been very quiet for a very long time and have suddenly remembered that noise is allowed. Rodriguez taught someone a card game. Kowalski played trumpet for 40 minutes, and it was still bad, and nobody asked him to stop. Osi reorganized the medical bay by singing to herself. Diaz ran nav calculations that the computer had already run, but this time not because he needed the math to feel real, just because he liked the math, and now there was room to like things again. Vasquez sat in her chair and drank freeze-dried coffee and watched the bearing and did not sleep. She didn't need to sleep yet. She needed to think. The Keth were still up there. Whatever damage they had done to the lattice, they had done to one installation on the ocean floor of one planet. The dreadnoughts had retreated from the Mariana Zone, but they had not left the solar system. The occupation was not over. The war, if it could be called a war, this terrible asymmetric thing, this endurance contest between overwhelming force and sheer refusal to stop existing, the war was not over. Something had changed. The Keth had built their plan around a particular assumption about humans, that they would not act without certainty, that they would wait for consensus and authorization and protocol, that they would not fire 4 torpedoes from the bottom of the world's deepest trench at an alien installation defended by capital ships on the basis of a theory held by one exhausted woman who hadn't slept properly in 2 months. They had been wrong about that. Not wrong about humans in general. Humans were cautious, procedural, institutional, prone to committees and second opinions and measured responses. The Keth analysis had probably been statistically accurate across the broad distribution of human behavior. They just hadn't accounted for the outliers. They hadn't accounted for the people who, when told the margin was 4 torpedoes and a theory, said, "That's enough." She thought of all the people she hadn't been able to account for either. The Adirondacks 42, scattered across 60 kilometers of ocean floor. The surface population she hadn't had communication with in 18 months, whose fates she could only guess at from the scale of what she'd seen when she surfaced. Scientists and engineers and military personnel and civilians and children who had been on the surface when the Keth arrived. and had not had the advantage of 300 meters of cold water between themselves and the initial sweep. She would find out what was left when she got there. And there would be something left because there was always something left. Because the particular characteristic of humans that the Keth had most seriously miscalculated was not their technology or their strategy or their willingness to fire from the bottom of a trench. It was simpler than that. It was the thing Rodriguez wrote on tape and stuck to his forehead as a reminder. Still breathing. The comms relay was where it was supposed to be. They reached it on the morning of the fourth day, running a careful approach that took 6 hours because there was no reason to survive the Mariana Trench only to blunder into something with bad situational awareness at the end. The relay was a fixed underwater antenna array, nuclear-powered, designed to survive depth and pressure and the absence of maintenance for years. It had a long-wave transmitter that could push a signal through 50 meters of water and several thousand kilometers of salt ocean. Vasquez composed the message herself. She kept it short because the relay's window was narrow and because she'd never trusted herself to be eloquent and because the message didn't need to be eloquent. It said, Glaive operational, Lattice keystone destroyed, atmospheric restoration in progress. We are looking for other survivors. If you are receiving this, respond on this frequency. If you cannot respond, listen for further transmissions. You are not alone. She sent it on a 12-hour loop. Then she waited. The first response came 14 hours later. A submarine, the USS Tennyson, SSN something, designation partially garbled, operating out of the North Atlantic on emergency protocol since week 6 of the occupation. 4 crew. Operational. 2 weeks of provisions remaining, but they knew where more were. The second response came 6 hours after that. Not a submarine. A shore station. A mountain facility in Iceland, apparently. One of the listening posts that had gone to emergency lockdown protocols when the Keth arrived and had been sealed since. 12 personnel. They'd lost 4 in the first month. They were out of most things, but not out of everything. They had been listening to the relay for 60 days, hoping someone would transmit. Then a fishing trawler, of all things, operating on a diesel engine in the Norwegian fjords, crewed by 7 people who had spent the occupation moving between hidden sea caves. Then a research vessel. Then a British submarine that began its transmission with the words "We'd given you up for lost," and Vasquez read it and had to set the printout down for a moment. By the end of the week, she had 19 contacts. Not enough. Not nearly enough to account for the population of the planet. The accounting would take months, years, and she knew the number at the end would not be good. She knew there were things she would learn in the coming weeks that would require the thoughts she'd been filing away in the during place. The ones she'd told herself she'd have after. And now after had arrived. And she would have to have them. 19 contacts. 19 voices on the relay, confirming what the Glaive's actions had changed. The sky was going out. The Keth were repositioning. Planet was still, technically beneath alien occupation. But the occupation had developed a crack, and cracks had a way of propagating. Sorrel brought her a proper meal, reconstituted but warm. He set it on the armrest of her chair without comment, and, after a moment she ate it. And it tasted of nothing and everything, the way bad food tastes when you've been hungry long enough. You should sleep, he said. I know. 6 hours. I'll hold the watch. She looked at the relay board. 19 contacts, all transmitting on schedule, the Glaive's reply cycling on its loop. The passive array was quiet. The hull, at 300 meters, was quiet. The crew was running at 60% of shift capacity, because she'd ordered rest rotations. And for once in 18 months they were following the order without argument. You know what the Keth got wrong, she said. She wasn't asking. She was thinking out loud in the way she occasionally did when Sorrel was in the room. Because he had the useful quality of listening without needing to respond, he waited. They built a plan that required us to act rationally, she said. Census, authorization, unified response. Wait for certainty. Wait for the institutions to function. For someone in authority to say go. She paused. But we don't always do that. Sometimes one person runs the math and decides the theory is good enough and fires 4 torpedoes from the bottom of a trench. She picked up her coffee cup. Empty. She held it anyway. They built their plan for a committee. They got us. Sorrel was quiet for a moment. Then, get some sleep, Commander. She got 6 hours. When she woke, the relay board had 23 contacts. She sat up and read through the new ones and felt something she recognized after a moment as the early structural foundation of hope. Not the thing itself, not yet, but the thing that hope gets built on. 3 voices in the dark, each one meaning someone had survived. Someone had kept a reactor running, or a diesel turning, or a shore battery charged. Someone had found a cave or a depth, or a fjord, and refused, stubbornly and without elegance and against all reasonable probability, to stop being alive. She dressed. She went to the control room. She put her hand on the back of her chair. But she didn't sit down yet. Kowalski, she said. What do I have on passive? Kowalski looked at his array, checked it twice. Surface clear to the horizon, sky. A pause, a small recalibration of his voice. Sky is clear. Stars, stars. She hadn't seen stars in 73 days. She climbed the ladder, opened the hatch. Cold hit her first, sharp and clean. The ocean around the glaive was dark and flat under a sky that was not normal, not yet. The edges still smudged with residual glow where the last nodes were failing, but partially clear. Overhead, stars. She looked up at them for a long time. The Keth had built the lattice to render the earth. They had done it because they were old and powerful. And they had done it to 100 other worlds, and it had always worked. Or it had worked often enough that they had built their confidence around it. The way institutions build confidence around things that usually work, the universe did not care about, usually. Vasquez stood on the hull of her submarine in the cold dark, 42 people sleeping and working below her, 23 voices alive on the relay. And she breathed the clean salt air of an ocean that was beginning, very slowly, to cool, and she thought, we have so much work to do. Then she went back down, sealed the hatch, and got to it.